The Steakhouse Secret. The rain had been falling over Lowe's Angels for hours, painting the streets in shimmering reflections of neon lights and passing headlights. Most people hurried home on nights like this, eager to escape the cold drizzle. But inside a quiet steakhouse on the edge of the city, the atmosphere was warm, dimly lit, and peaceful. It was the kind of place that regulars loved: leather booths, low jazz music, and the rich smell of grilled steak drifting through the air. The door opened with a soft chime. A man stepped inside wearing a dark overcoat and a low-pulled hat. His shoulders were relaxed, but his eyes quietly scanned the room as if he wanted to be certain no one recognized him. Few people would have guessed that the man removing his coat at the entrance was none other than Dean Martin. The legendary singer and Hollywood star had come here for one simple reason. He wanted to be invisible. For decades, crowds had followed him everywhere: theaters, casinos, restaurants. His voice filled arenas, and his smile lit up television screens across America. But sometimes fame felt like a cage. Tonight, Dean Martin wanted something different. No applause. No cameras. No autograph seekers. Just dinner. The hostess greeted him politely, unaware of the celebrity standing before her. "Table for one." Dean gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was calm, warm, and unmistakably smooth, though she didn't recognize it. She led him to a corner booth near the back, one that offered privacy and a view of the entire restaurant. Dean sat down and let out a slow breath. For the first time that day, he felt relaxed. A waitress approached moments later carrying a menu and a glass of water. She looked to be in her early 20s. Her brown hair was tied neatly behind her head, and though her uniform was simple, there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. "Good evening," she said gently. "My name's Clara. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Dean smiled politely. "Nice to meet you, Clara." She handed him the menu. "What can I get started for you?" Dean didn't even need to look. "I'll have the house steak, medium rare, and coffee." Clara nodded. "Excellent choice." As she turned to walk away, Dean noticed something about her expression. Most waitresses smiled politely out of habit. But Clara's smile looked genuine, like someone who truly cared about the people she served. And that small detail caught his attention. While he waited, Dean leaned back and listened to the quiet conversations around him. A couple celebrating an anniversary. Two businessmen discussing a deal. A small family sharing dessert. It felt normal, peaceful, something Hollywood rarely allowed. 15 minutes later, Clara returned carrying the plate. The steak was perfectly grilled, steam rising from its surface. The smell alone was enough to make anyone hungry. "Here you go," she said, placing it in front of him. "Medium rare, just like you asked." Dean nodded appreciatively. "Looks perfect." She poured fresh coffee into his cup. "Let me know if you need anything." Dean picked up his knife and fork. For the next few minutes, the world faded away. The steak really was perfect. Juicy, tender, exactly how he liked it. He had taken only a few bites when Clara returned quietly to the table. But this time something was different. Instead of asking if everything was okay, she gently placed a folded piece of paper beside his plate. Her expression had changed. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't scared. It was serious. Dean looked up, slightly confused. "Is something wrong?" Clara shook her head slowly. "No, sir." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I just thought you should read this." Dean glanced down at the note. For a moment he assumed it was the check. But it was. The paper was old, carefully folded, almost like someone had carried it for years. Dean slowly opened it, and the moment his eyes scanned the words, his entire body froze. The color drained from his face. For the first time that night, the calm Hollywood legend looked completely stunned. The note contained only one sentence. A sentence that reached back into a past Dean Martin had spent decades trying to forget. He looked up at Clara again. "How did you get this?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she said something even more surprising. My grandmother told me if I ever saw you, I had to give it back. Dean's heartbeat quickened, because he suddenly realized something impossible. The handwriting on that note. He recognized it instantly. It belonged to someone from a night long ago. A night that had changed two lives forever. And as the rain continued falling outside the steakhouse windows, Dean Martin understood that this quiet dinner was about to turn into something far more powerful than he ever expected. Because the message on that small piece of paper carried a secret that had been waiting more than 30 years to return to him. And the young waitress standing before him was somehow connected to it, the note that reopened the past. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller. For a moment, the sounds around the room faded into the background. The quiet jazz music, the clinking glasses, the low conversations, everything seemed distant. All Dean could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. The small folded note trembled slightly in his hand. Across the table, Clara stood still, watching him carefully. She could see the shock on his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Dean looked up. His voice was softer now, almost uncertain. How did you get this? Clara pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly, something she normally would never do while working. But this moment was different. I've had it for years, she said quietly. Dean stared at her. That handwriting, he said slowly, I haven't seen it in decades. Clara nodded. My grandmother kept it in a small wooden box. Dean's eyes narrowed slightly. A wooden box? Yes, she said. She called it her most important memory. Dean leaned back in the booth, trying to steady himself. Because the words written on that paper were not random. They were something deeply personal. Something from a night long ago. A night he had almost forgotten, yet never truly escaped. The note read, One day you will sit in a quiet place and remember the promise you made to a stranger. Dean whispered the sentence out loud. His voice carried a strange mixture of disbelief and recognition. Your grandmother, he said slowly. What was her name? Clara answered without hesitation. Elinors. The name struck Dean like a quiet thunderclap. For a moment, his gaze drifted away, toward the rain streaking down the restaurant window. Memories he hadn't visited in years began rising to the surface. A small diner. A winter night. A young woman with kind eyes. And a promise. 35 years earlier. Dean Martin wasn't yet the legend the world would come to know. Yes, he was already famous. But fame had come with chaos. Tour, interviews, parties, endless expectations. The world saw glamour. But inside, Dean was exhausted. One night, after a long performance in Chicago, he had slipped away from the crowds just like he had tonight. He walked alone through cold streets until he found a small late-night diner. It was quiet, almost empty, and the only person working there was a young waitress named Elinor. She had greeted him with the same warm kindness Clara carried tonight. But what Dean remembered most about her was something else. She didn't recognize him. To her, he wasn't a celebrity. He was simply a tired man ordering coffee. And for the first time in weeks, Dean had felt like a normal person. They talked, not about music, not about Hollywood, but about life. Elinor told him she wanted to open a small cafe someday. A place where people could come when they felt lost or tired. A place where strangers leave feeling better than when they arrived, she had said. Dean had laughed softly at the idea. You think coffee can fix people's lives? Elinor smiled. No, she said. But kindness can. The conversation stayed with him long after that night ended. Before leaving, Dean had taken a small piece of paper and written something down. A promise. If she ever opened that cafe, he would come back and perform there for free. Just to bring people in. Just to help her dream grow. Elinor had laughed, thinking it was just a joke. But Dean had meant every word. And as he left, she wrote a sentence on the back of the same paper and handed it to him. One day you will sit in a quiet place and remember the promise you made to a stranger. Dean had carried that note in his pocket for weeks. But life moved fast. Tour continued. Movies began. Years passed. And somewhere along the way, the promise faded into memory. Now, sitting in this quiet steakhouse decades later, Dean slowly placed the note back on the table. "You're her granddaughter," he said quietly. Clara nodded. She talked about that night for the rest of her life. Dean looked surprised. "She remembered me." Clara smiled gently. "Of course she did." Dean exhaled slowly. "What happened to the cafe?" Clara's expression changed slightly. For the first time since the conversation began, there was sadness in her eyes. "She tried," Clara said softly. "For years." Dean felt something tighten in his chest. But life got hard. Medical bills, rising rent, family problems. The cafe dream slowly slipped further away. "But she never threw away that note," Clara continued. "She kept it in the box and told me something when I was little." Dean leaned forward. "What did she say?" Clara looked directly into his eyes. "She said someday I might meet the man who wrote that promise." Dean swallowed. "And if I did?" "She told me to give the note back to him." Silence filled the booth again. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Dean looked down at his unfinished steak. Then back at Clara. "And why tonight?" Clara took a slow breath. "Because my grandmother passed away last week." The words landed heavily. Dean's expression softened. "I'm sorry." Clara nodded. "Before she died, she told me something else." Dean waited. "She said the promise wasn't about music." Dean frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Clara leaned forward. "She said the promise was about reminding someone that kindness always comes back." Dean sat quietly, absorbing her words. Then he asked the question slowly forming in his mind. "So why bring me the note now?" Clara hesitated. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out another folded paper. But this one looked newer. She placed it beside the old note. Dean unfolded it. His eyes widened. It was a business license application. For a small cafe. The name at the top read, Eliner's Place. Dean looked up slowly. "You're opening it?" Clara nodded. "I'm trying." Dean studied the document again. Then something unexpected happened. The famous singer, the Hollywood legend, the man who had performed for millions, started smiling. Not the stage smile the world knew, but a quiet, genuine one. Because suddenly, a promise from 35 years ago was standing right in front of him. And this time, Dean Martin knew exactly what he was going to do. But Clara had no idea that the decision he was about to make would change both of their lives forever. And what he would do next would shock the entire city, the promise that refused to fade. The rain outside the restaurant had grown heavier. Drops struck the windows in a steady rhythm, like a quiet drumbeat marking the passing of time. Inside the booth, the two pieces of paper lay side by side. One was old and worn, carrying a memory from 35 years ago. The other was fresh, carrying a dream that had not yet begun. Dean looked down at them both. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Across the table, Clara waited patiently. She had already said everything she came to say. The note had been returned. The promise had been remembered. What happened next was no longer her decision. Finally, Dean folded the business paper carefully and slid it back toward her. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. Clara blinked. "What do you mean? Is the cafe really going to happen?" Clara hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. "I want it to," she said softly. Dean studied her face carefully. "But," Clara sighed, "but dreams cost money." Dean nodded slowly. That was a sentence he understood well. "How much are you short?" he asked. Clara shook her head quickly. "Oh no, I didn't come here to ask you for help." Dean gave a small smile. "I know that." She looked down at the table. "I just wanted you to know she never forgot you." For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Dean leaned back in the booth, thinking. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights briefly washing the restaurant walls in pale white light. Then Dean suddenly stood up. Clara looked confused. "Are you leaving?" "Not yet," Dean replied. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. From inside it, he removed a small business card and placed it on the table. Clara looked down at it. Her eyes widened slightly. It carried a simple name and phone number. But the name printed on the card wasn't Dean Martin. It belonged to someone else. Someone powerful. Someone in the music industry. Clara looked back up at him. "What is this?" "A door," Dean said calmly. Clara frowned. "I don't understand." Dean sat down again and folded his hands. "You want to open a leaner's place?" Clara nodded. "Yes. And your grandmother wanted it to be a place where strangers leave feeling better than when they arrived." "Yes." Dean tapped the business card gently. "Well, sometimes dreams just need a little noise to get started." Clara stared at him. "What kind of noise?" Dean leaned forward. "The kind that gets the whole city talking." Clara felt a strange mix of curiosity and worry. "Dean, what are you planning?" He smiled. "Do you know what happens when people hear a rumor that something impossible might happen?" Clara shook her head. "They show up." Clara still looked unsure. "What rumors?" Dean reached for the old note again. The paper had faded slightly over time, but the words were still clear. "One day you will sit in a quiet place and remember the promise you made to a stranger." Dean read the line silently. Then he folded it and slipped it gently back into Clara's hand. "I think it's time that promise finally got fulfilled." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "You mean perform at the cafe?" Dean chuckled softly. "No." Clara blinked. "No. I mean something bigger." Clara felt her heart start to race. What could be bigger than that? Dean stood up again and placed some cash on the table for the meal. Then he leaned closer so only she could hear him. What if the opening night of Alina's place had the biggest surprise performance this city has seen in years? Clara's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious." "But why would you do that?" Dean shrugged. "Because 35 years ago, a kind waitress reminded me that strangers can change your life." Clara didn't know what to say. Dean picked up his coat. "But there's one small problem." Clara felt nervous again. "What problem?" Dean smiled. "No one can know about it." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "If people find out too early, it ruins the magic." Clara looked down at the cafe license again. "You really think people would come?" Dean laughed quietly. "Clara, if word spreads that something unusual is happening at a tiny cafe opening." He paused. "People will line up around the block." Clara imagined it. The cafe lights glowing at night. People laughing. Coffee cups clinking. Music filling the room. Her grandmother's dream alive. But suddenly, a troubling thought entered her mind. "Dean." "Yes." "What if it fails?" Dean stopped halfway toward the door. Then he turned back slowly. For a moment, his expression was serious. "Dreams only fail," he said gently, "when people stop believing in them." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. Dean walked toward the exit. But just before leaving, he turned one last time. "And Clara." "Yes." "Don't tell anyone what happened tonight." She nodded slowly. "I won't." Dean gave one final smile. "Good." Then he stepped out into the rain and disappeared into the night. Clara sat alone in the booth. The two papers were still in her hands. the old promise, and the new dream. But she had no idea that Dean Martin was already making phone calls that very night. Calls that would set something extraordinary in motion. Within a week, the entire city would be whispering about a mysterious cafe opening. Within 2 weeks, lines would begin forming outside a place that didn't even exist yet. And when opening night finally arrived, something would happen that no one inside that cafe would ever forget. Not Clara, not the crowd, and certainly not the man who had quietly walked into a steakhouse on a rainy night, just hoping for a quiet dinner. The night the promise came alive. The small building on the corner of Maple Street had never attracted much attention before. For years it had been empty. The faded brick walls carried the memory of an old bakery that had closed long ago. The windows had once been dusty and forgotten, and people walking by rarely gave the place a second glance. But now everything was different. Warm lights glowed from inside. Fresh paint brightened the walls. New wooden tables sat neatly arranged across the floor. Above the door hung a simple sign, Aliner's Place. Clara stood in the center of the cafe, staring at it all. Her hands trembled slightly. The dream her grandmother once spoke about in quiet conversations was no longer just an idea. It was real, but tonight was the night that would decide everything. Outside, people were already gathering. At first, it had been only a few curious neighbors. Then word began spreading. Something special was happening here. No one knew exactly what it was, but rumors had begun traveling across the city. A mysterious opening. A surprise event. An unforgettable night. Within an hour, the line outside stretched halfway down the block. Clara stepped toward the front window and peeked through the curtain. Her heart started racing. "Why are there so many people already?" she whispered. Her friend Daniel, who had been helping her prepare the cafe all week, laughed nervously. "I told you the rumors were spreading." Clara turned toward him. "But we never told anyone anything." Daniel shrugged. "That's how rumors work." But Clara knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. Somewhere out there, Dean Martin was quietly pulling strings. For the past 2 weeks, strange things had been happening. Local newspapers mentioned the cafe opening. A popular radio host hinted about a mysterious performance. Even a music blogger wrote an article asking one question: what secret event is happening at Aliner's Place? Clara still couldn't believe it. 2 weeks ago, she had been serving tables at the steakhouse. Now the entire city seemed curious about her cafe. She looked down at the small wooden box sitting on the counter. Inside, it was the note her grandmother had saved for decades. Clara touched the lid gently. "Grandma, I hope this works." Suddenly, Daniel glanced toward the door. "Clara." She turned. "What?" "You might want to see this." Clara walked over. Daniel slowly opened the front door just a few inches. The sound outside rushed in. Dozens of voices. People laughing. Cars passing. And the long line stretching along the sidewalk. Clara's eyes widened. "Oh my goodness." Daniel whispered, "This is bigger than we expected." Clara swallowed nervously. "But what if Dean doesn't come?" Daniel looked confused. "Wait, you still haven't heard from him?" Clara shook her head. "No. Not even a message." "No." Daniel closed the door slowly. "That's strange." Clara felt a wave of doubt begin creeping into her mind. What if she had misunderstood everything? What if Dean Martin had only been speaking kindly that night in the steakhouse? What if the promise had already been fulfilled just by remembering? Her stomach tightened. The cafe opening had already been announced. The crowd was already here. But the biggest moment of the night might never happen. Clara sat down at the nearest table and buried her face in her hands. Maybe this was a mistake. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hey." She looked up. "You built this place," he said gently. "No matter what happens tonight, that's already incredible." Clara nodded slowly, but deep inside, she still felt the weight of expectation. Because the entire city was waiting for something. And no one knew what that something was. The clock on the wall ticked toward 7:00 p.m. Opening time. Clara stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward the door. "Okay," she said. "Let's open." Daniel unlocked the door. The moment it swung open, the crowd outside erupted into excited chatter. People began stepping inside, filling the cafe quickly. Within minutes, every table was taken. The room buzzed with energy. Coffee machines hissed. Cups clinked. Strangers began talking and laughing with each other. Exactly the kind of atmosphere Alina had dreamed about. Clara moved from table to table greeting customers. But even as she smiled, one thought stayed in her mind. Where is he? The clock reached 7:20 p.m. Then 7:35. Still nothing. The crowd had grown restless. People whispered to each other. Is the rumor true? Is someone famous coming? Was it just a publicity trick? Clara's heart sank deeper with each passing minute. By 7:45 p.m., Daniel walked up beside her. Clara. She didn't even look at him. I know. Daniel spoke quietly. Maybe it wasn't meant to happen. Clara forced a smile. You're right. She stepped toward the center of the room. A small microphone stood on a simple stage platform in the corner. Originally, it had been placed there just in case. Clara picked it up. The room slowly grew quiet. Thank you all for coming tonight, she began. Her voice trembled slightly. This cafe was inspired by my grandmother Alina. She believed a place like this could make people feel less alone. The crowd listened politely. Clara continued. Tonight may not have the surprise some people were expecting. Just as she finished the sentence, the cafe door opened. At first, no one noticed. The room was focused on Clara. But then someone near the entrance gasped. Another person turned. Then another. A wave of murmurs spread across the cafe. Clara paused mid-sentence. What's happening? Daniel whispered urgently. Clara, look. She slowly turned toward the door. And there he was, standing quietly at the entrance. No spotlight, no announcement, just a calm smile beneath a familiar hat. It was Dean Martin. For a moment, the entire cafe froze. Then someone whispered loudly, Is that really him? Another voice followed. Oh my goodness, it is. Clara's eyes filled with shock. Dean walked forward slowly, removing his coat. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path toward the small stage. When he reached Clara, he leaned toward the microphone. Sorry I'm late, he said casually. The room erupted into laughter and applause. Clara stared at him, still stunned. You actually came. Dean smiled warmly. I made a promise, did I? He stepped onto the small stage and looked around the cafe. Every chair was filled. People stood along the walls. Some even pressed against the windows, trying to see inside. Dean leaned toward the microphone again. Before I sing anything tonight, he said, I want to tell you why this place exists. The room fell silent. Dean pointed gently toward Clara. Many years ago, I met a kind waitress who believed a small cafe could change people's lives. Clara felt tears forming. She never stopped believing in that dream, Dean continued. And tonight, her granddaughter made it real. The crowd erupted into applause. Clara wiped her eyes quickly. Dean turned back toward the microphone. Now I think this cafe deserves a proper opening. He adjusted the microphone slightly. Then, with the same smooth voice that had once filled theaters around the world, Dean Martin began to sing. The music filled the room like warm sunlight. People sat frozen in amazement. Some smiled. Some wiped away tears. And in that moment, the cafe Alina had dreamed about decades earlier became exactly what she had imagined. a place where strangers gathered, a place where kindness lived, and a place where one forgotten promise had finally come home. Clara looked toward the small wooden box on the counter. Inside it, the old note rested quietly. The promise had been remembered, and now it would never be forgotten again.